Welcome back. Happy May 11th. I asked Brandon Weichert yesterday if the antagonism toward Israel was anti-Israel or anti-Jewish or anti-Western or anti-Christian. His response, a little of all of that. One listener, I think not Jewish, emailed me, quote, if the Jewish people's homeland were any other nation, the problem would be that nation, close quote. In other words, the country itself is not the issue. It's what it stands for and what it does, which is the same contempt America receives, either from the Islamo-fascist world or the progressive woke socialists it has allied with, in what Zuhdi Jasser calls the red-green axis. Here's how he defines that axis. An axis as old as the Adolf Hitler Grand Mufti of Jerusalem Pact of 1941. How did the Mufti define that pact? By saying, quote, Germany and the Arabs had the same cause, the elimination of Jews, close quote. How did Hitler define that pact? According to German records, he wrote, quote, Germany stood for uncompromising war against the Jews. That naturally included active opposition to the Jewish national homeland. Germany would furnish positive and practical aid to the Arabs as we were involved in the same struggle. Germany's objective is solely the destruction of the Jewish element residing in the Arab sphere. In that hour, the Mufti would be our most authoritative spokesman for the Arab world, close quote. This turns upside down, of course. Rashida Tlaib's claimed that it was her people in the 1940s that sacrificed for the Jews. They didn't. They teamed up with the worst sacrificer of Jews in world history, but I digress. Back to Jasser's explanation of the red-green axis, which helps explain why so many of the left are so very antagonistic to the West, which would include Israel as much as the United States, as both countries are exemplars of the idea of the West, combining the ethics and teachings of Jerusalem and Athens, or the Bible and Western political philosophy, and its concerns over happiness, justice, equality, and freedom. That minorities are given more rights in these exemplars than in any other system or ideology or country on earth drives the progressives batty. But it is both a design and feature of Western thought. So is self-critique, and that's why, in short, we flagellate ourselves in public, but there can't be condemnatory behavior against minorities in China because they're a Marxist marvel, after all. There can't be condemnatory behavior against women or religious or sexual minorities in Iran. Iran is governed by a popular and anti-U.S. regime that exists to thwart Western colonialism and imperialism, after all. There can't be condemnatory behavior against any entity or country that is anti-West. Thus, that Mahmoud Abbas is in his 15th year of his 4-year term as president, submitting himself to no more elections or democracy, is just a small detail of insignificance, for he is poised against Israel and the West, after all. Which helps explain why his movement supported Saddam Hussein in his wars against America. But America and Israel, with their commitments to social, civil, and political equality, are to be condemned because, for one reason or another, something called human nature, I guess, those countries aren't perfect and have not brought down, nor ever said they could bring down heaven to earth. Oh, they've come asymptotically close, but the distance between the asymptote and the X or Y axis is the very exact ground of the crises and complaints the Marxists try to exploit. So the country that ended slavery 156 years ago is worse than the country that has it now, though the first, perhaps because the first example is a Republican democracy called America, and the second one is a Marxist autocracy called China. So the country that battles terrorism daily and faces a propaganda machine for every normal behavior, like evicting from homes those who refuse to obey court orders of eviction due to lack of rent payment, but gives its minority population every political and civil right it gives its own majoritarian people, including the right to speech and press and own property and vote and be elected into public office. This country is the one that it's worse than its opponents, who kill homosexuals for being homosexual and dissidents for dissenting. Though the first receives contempt, perhaps because the first is a Jewish majority democracy, and the second examples are about 30 countries in a region, that same region, that are not democracies and are socialist redoubts who maintain or fight for power based exclusively on ethnic and religious legacies and claims to power. The idea of the West counterpoised all this. Religious and ethnic distinctions is the basis for maleficent, or for that matter, beneficent treatment, whether at the United Nations, where oppressive despotic nations such as China and Venezuela and Iran and Syria and Qatar work against American interests, or in Congress, where the squad shills for both the domestic radicals of BLM and the Islamist movements. The world's red-green axis has landed in this country, Zuhdi Jasser writes. Though the masses are largely oblivious to the strategic doublespeak, the goals of all these groups are explicit. We're trained Marxists, co-founder of BLM Patrice Cullors says. Co-founder Opal Tometi considers the brutal and corrupt Maduro regime in Venezuela a participatory democracy with fair and transparent election systems. Quote, I use Asada's powerful demand in my organizing work, close quote, wrote Alicia Garza, the other BLM founder, and referring to Asuda Shakur, a violent murderer on the FBI's most wanted terrorist list, hiding in Cuba. And BLM's lists of demands, which reads like socialist code, is even more revealing. In its own words, BLM wishes to disrupt the Western prescribed nuclear family structure, a demand that many black leaders have publicly decried and repudiated, pointing to the fact that absentee fathers is one of the most pressing issues currently plaguing their community. BLM's coalition website, the Movement for Black Lives, lists, quote, a radical and sustainable redistribution of wealth as demand number one. Both BLM and modern Islamism, whether in Syria or Iran or Saudi Arabia or the West Bank, are street-led movements whose members, whether clerics or activists, see themselves as grassroots revolutionaries, not modest reformers. They are akin to the Red Guards of Mao's Chinese Revolution or the Citizens' Revolt of the French Revolution. Driven by nihilism, they tear down historical statues, ban books, and rename institutions and cities. Global Islamist tyrants have been engaging in this behavior for decades, the most notable being the destruction of Palmyra and other ancient sites by ISIS and the Taliban's bombing of the 17-year-old 8,200 feet Buddhas of Banyan, a UNESCO World Heritage Site. And while we were initially led to believe BLM only wished to topple Confederate statues, we have now seen abolitionists, founding fathers, Civil War Union heroes, and former slaves themselves all come down at the hands of BLM activists. Similarly, TV shows are being canceled, movie scenes removed, names, logos, and mascots of schools and consumer products changed. Ironically, as Islamists publicly cheer on these acts of vandalism, they ignore rationalize their own history as slave owners, which includes the Prophet Muhammad. Jonathan Brown at Georgetown University tracked in such apologetic polemics when he went so far as to defend the roots of Islamist slavery even recently. On a global scale, the most obvious link between BLM and modern Islamism is the embrace of anti-Semitism, from French anti-racist protesters shouting dirty Jews to multiple anti-Semitic scandals plaguing the BLM UK, to the arbitrary and glaring anti-Israel clause inserted into BLM's original charter, In the same way, anti-Semitism has been a defining feature of modern-day Islamists, from the Muslim Brotherhood to New York City's notorious Imam Siraj Wahhaj. The overlap on this point is not insignificant. Melina Abdullah, the head organizer of BLM Los Angeles, is also an Islamist supporter of Nation of Islam leader Louis Farrakhan, who compares Jews to termites and bloodsuckers. He referred to Hitler as a very great man and attributes gay marriage, abortion, and homosexual sex to, quote, satanic influences of Talmudic Jews, close quote. Speaking of Farrakhan, posting videos of this Jew-hating, misogynist homophobe on social media in support of BLM has recently become a favorite hobby of Hollywood celebrities and major league athletes. And of course, Twitter and Facebook have no problem with it. Anti-Israel organizations have been flooding their social media feeds with messages of BLM solidarity. American Muslims for Palestine, a grassroots organization that the ADL has said provides a platform for anti-Semitism, promotes BLM protests, and now hosts a monthly webinar series called Let's Talk BLM. Ironically, AMP's newest national development coordinator, Mohammed Habeh, has recently referred to blacks as Abid, the Arabic word for slaves. On social media, he has made racist jokes about Somalis and said that if he ever dated a black girl, his mother would think he had AIDS. Similarly, Islamist Samir al-Hado was once invited to speak at a BLM protest in Chicago. Al-Hado's social media is replete with racist content, including the vile claim that I can't even say it. So much for intersectional anti-racism. Both BLM and modern Islamism are cut from the same cloth. They are victim-obsessed, ethnocentric struggles that frame every difference of outcome in terms of identity, whether race or religion. They are the commissars of the thought police, the connoisseurs of cultural demagoguery. Whether out of allegiance or fear, we have witnessed the entirety of the Democratic Party, and too many swaths inside the Republican Party fall into their lockstep narratives. The only way to fight them is to recognize the strategic similarities and recommit ourselves to authentic ideological diversity. No race should bend the knee to any other, for we are all equal in the eyes of God. Just so, thank you, doctor. Now, if only you were a psychiatrist, so I could understand why the socialist woke here, the pro-feminist, pro-gender equality, pro-sexual orientation, freedom, pro-choice, minority representations, and rights woke here. I need a psychiatrist to explain to me how those who support those things so vociferously oppose the only country that grants all of them and more in the Middle East and defends the countries that don't. It seems to me a case study in schizophrenia. But then again, part of this perhaps can be explained by the fact that Marxism is chock full of paradoxes, one of which is, as one professor put it, the notion that socialism can be implemented through the state in the first place, a centralized, repressive state supposedly of the workers which nationalizes the economy can somehow, some way be liberating. Tied to this is a philosophical outlook which leads to belief that we can know the truth not as a matter of natural right or law or reason, but as a matter of class or race struggle. Property for Marxists, like race for Nazis, may be the original truth detector for their engine of history and future. For us, it's God and reason. We get this from the Bible and from Western philosophy. That's why their regimes end up in collective murder and imprisonment as policy, and our regimes prosecute murder and imprison the guilty and liberate the free. Let's not put a stake in it, shall we?